And just to give a broad outline of what my big core argument is that it seems to me that at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, Irish Protestants went from a position in which they were exceptionally suspicious of the Irish language because it was identified culturally and politically with their opponents, to a position towards the end of the century when there was an interest within that community which was endeavouring and indeed promoting inquiry and investigation into this. And had everything gone according to plan, indeed, they might well have funded the establishment of the first professorship of the Irish language at Trinity College, though for reasons that I hopefully will try and explain, that didn't become the case. Now, in the process of examining this subject, I will be touching on a man by the name of John Richardson, a member of the Church of Ireland that was based at Turbot in County Cavan. And I mention him because to some degree he was in the tradition of Bishop Beadle, who I believe you had a speaker talking to you yesterday. Now, so to begin, as the 17th century drew to a close, the prevailing attitude of Irish Protestants to the Irish language was hostile and unaccommodating. This may be attributed in the first place to inherited attitudes, first given expression as far back as the 12th century by Gerard of Wales, but reiterated more vigorously in the 16th century, and based on the premise and on the assumption and the calculation that Irish culture and civilization was, as it was described, quote, barbarous in all points and a barrier in the way to the onward march of civility. Now, the language of civility, which shaped discourse very much in the course of the 16th century, did the latter part of the 17th, certainly in the 18th, yield to that of a discourse of improvement. But the perception of Irish culture as second rate persisted. The Irish language in particular was perceived with great negativity. Commenting in the record he made of his visit to Ireland in 1699, the rector of East Durham in Norfolk in England, a man by the name of James Verdon, offered the observation, schooled in the prevailing theories of the origins of language in the Anglophone world, that Irish was, as he's put it, at the fag end of those at Babel. What he meant by this, obviously, was that not just that the Irish language was barren and defective, as some was disposed to perceive the culture, but also that it was one of the less distinguished languages to emerge out of that, what was regarded then as the ultimate repository of human language, the Tower of Babel. Now, in the Irish context, this negative perception was given additional authority by the attitude of reform religion, as the Protestant community at large in Ireland concluded that their inability to convert the Irish Catholic population could be explained by reference to the fact that the Irish language was not suited to the communication of advanced ideas, and therefore that it was not an appropriate medium of evangelization. There were, of course, additional practical and attitudinal obstacles. The conviction that evangelization to the medium of Irish must impede the policy of Anglicization, which had priority, it was important in this respect. Anglicization was to be pursued, well then it was the promotion of the usage of English, which was key. Now, this was not a view that everybody accepted, but it certainly was the majority view. There were some, and I can't put a name on the author of the following observation, who remarked that it was, and I quote, impracticable to destroy the mother tongue of any people by the severest methods of conquest, suggests that there were those who took a more constructive attitude. And indeed, those who took a more constructive attitude to the language included the previously mentioned Bishop Beadle, who pursued the translation of the Old Testament in the 1630s into Irish, and Robert Boyle, the scientist whose intervention paved the way for the publication in 1685, finally, of an Irish language Bible. However, their arguments rested on, or seemed to hit a rather stony soil, because in both instances, those who were more wary would have observed they were followed within short order by outbreaks of acute communal violence. 1641 rebellion in first instance, and the Jacobite Rebellion Wars in more recently. Episodes that were seen to threaten the very existence of the Protestant interest in Ireland, and which encouraged, obviously, a sense of great wariness within the ranks of Irish Protestants. These attitudes inevitably, which had been reinforced, I would suggest, by the events of 1689 to 91, reinforced the negative disposition towards the Irish language and ensured that it was regarded by many within the ranks of Irish Protestantism, not only in primary political terms, but that it was in the interest of society at large to take steps to try and discourage it. Now, the irony of the matter is that though this point of view may well have been reinforced by ill feelings generated by the events of James II's brief reign, is that James II himself shared the general antipathy of Anglophones to the Irish language. His view was that the maintenance of a harmonious Anglo-Irish connection would be facilitated if the language supplanted. With this in mind, he counselled his son in his memoir that if he would ascend to the throne, he should support the establishment in Ireland of, quote, schools to teach the children of the old natives English, on the grounds that this would by degrees wear out the Irish language. Moreover, he went on, this would be for the advantage of the body of inhabitants, whether old or new, because it must over time lessen the animosities that were a feature of society there. Now, this was an aspiration, however negatively they may have recalled James II, that many Irish Protestants could endorse. The problem was that in the 1690s, was that many of them felt even more strongly. Be that as it may, the Irish language did not feature prominently on the agenda of the Protestant representatives who monopolised the membership of the Irish Parliament from 1692. But when it did arise, there was a certain disposition, one might suggest, to discourage its usage. This was informed and can be seen, for example, in the language utilised in the 1695 Act to Restrain Foreign Education, which is sometimes seen as one of the first of the body of anti-Catholic regulation we know as the penal laws, where there's a negative reference to the consequences of the fact that because of the existence of Catholic schools, Catholics in Ireland were not using the English habit and language. A more interesting, though not one we can penetrate the surface of, initiative in this respect, or in respect of language, was proposed some years later in 1697 by James II Viscount Lanesborough. He presented the House of Lords in September of 1697 with the measure for the suppression of the Irish language and encouraging the Irish to learn English. The object of the measure was claimed as to integrate, quote, the natives of the kingdom into the English government by obliging them not only to learn, but also to use no other vulgar language, vulgar in this instance meaning common, besides English. Interestingly, though, this was deemed a step too far, and for whatever reason, the measure did not progress upon report stage, and the fact that it was never reanimated, it would suggest it was not a popular strategy and was perceived as one beyond the capacity of society and government to sustain. Be that as it may, those like Lanesborough and those who supported him, and he had some support in his proposition in the House of Lords, were representative of a broader community within Ireland at this stage, within the Protestant elite, which shared this negative opinion of the Irish language, and which believed that where possible, the institutions of the state should play an important part in sustaining an environment which discouraged its use. This attitude was encouraged by the enduring conviction that Irish was not only a linguistically and socially inferior tongue, but also the medium through which those who sought to undermine the Protestant constitution in church and to state, and to replace it with a Catholic Jacobite regime, chose to progress their goals. The authorities inevitably contrived as best they could to disrupt Jacobitism by, among other matters, pursuing those who sought to articulate their Jacobite royalties through the medium of Irish. Now, we don't have anything like a full inventory of such prosecutions or such interventions, but I would just draw your attention to the fate of one Edward McGuinness, a tide waiter employed in the revenue service, who was dismissed from his post at Ringsend in Dublin in 1718, when colleagues informed his superiors that he had, and I quote, raised a glass and drank a health in Irish into King James III. I suspect in this instance, obviously, the issue was less as drinking in health in Irish, but obviously the fact he was drinking in health to King James, because the use of the language itself wasn't criminalized. The point is, though, that the generality of Irish Protestants were suspicious of the language. Indeed, the Reverend John Richardson, who we will encounter presently in terms of his devising a policy of evangelizing, observed apropos in 1712, quote, that with national prejudice and aversion, which still remains among too many of the English and Irish nations to one another, I know some of the natives of this kingdom who can speak English and yet will not, for no other reason but because it is English. The same motive on the other side induces some to be very earnest for abolishing the Irish language. They have a dislike to the nation, and this uncountably breeds a dislike to the language for which no other reason can be given but that it is Irish. In other words, the usage of language was freighted with a political consequence and a political identity. This is certainly the implication of Richardson's view about those who were judging others in terms of the usage of language. Their own position perhaps may have been a bit more subtle at times. In any event, what it illustrates, as we shall see soon as well, is that John Richardson, though he promoted the usage of Irish, was not free of the linguistic prejudices upon which he had written and was to write so insightfully. Yet because he prioritized the evangelizing of the Catholic population, and because he perceived that Irish was the medium through which this could be successfully pursued, he was following in established footsteps, notably on William Beadle, already mentioned, and Robert Boyle. Richardson was not a lone voice either. Indeed, the initiative for an attempt to try and put in place an evangelizing strategy through the Irish language was provided by a meeting of the lower house of convocation of the Church of Ireland, that is, which resolved in 1703 that the Church of Ireland was in earnest when it claimed it aspired to, quote, the speedy conversion of the papists of this kingdom. That's the end of quotation. It was necessary that a number of preachers capable of preaching in the Irish tongue were appointed to every diocese. The problem, as Richardson and others who took this position, problem indeed as convocation was well aware, was there were too few clergy with the requisite linguistic skills. The consequence of this was that it was to be 6 years, 1709, before convocation revisited the issue and approved a report advocating a major evangelizing initiative through the medium of Irish. Then, suggestion was that it was necessary that a policy would be pursued which must lead to the publication in the English character, it's in English, of the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, and the identification of some person to prepare a short exposition of the Church Catechism, particularly fitted for the instruction of popish recusants, that would be printed in bilingual form. Such a work was to ensue, and if you're looking for an image of such, just get onto the library's website and click on this talk indeed, and you'll see that's what it's illustrated with the title page provides in such an illustration. Preachers were still more important, though, than print. And it was in this context that the lower house of convocation recommended that steps were taken to ensure that each diocese was supplied with a number of, quote, fit persons to preach, catechize, and perform divine service in the Irish tongue. The problem was getting the resources to do this, and it was with this in mind that an appeal was undertaken to seek fiscal support from Parliament. and indeed to appeal directly to the Queen to authorise the establishment, quote, of a corporation capable of receiving and disposing charitable contributions. Now, as the attempt to try and involve Parliament and indeed to involve the Queen, the clerical advocates of evangelising through the medium of Irish at this point did not want for ambition. The identification of clergy with the skills and abilities and indeed the will to lead this was another matter entirely. There were hopes nonetheless that this problem would be eased in short order if a scheme which was then underway in Trinity College to equip newly ordained clergy with the skills to minister to Irish could be expanded. Now, the key figure in this, it was John Richardson, whose dates are 1669 to 1747, who was beneficed at Belturbet in County Cavan. They wanted to take up and pursue the initiative as outlined and the scheme as outlined by Convocation. To this end, they were successful in securing a font of Irish type in London. The suspicion is that it was the font that had been created to put into place Robert Boyle's idea. And the idea was that they would, by this means, quote, print the Bible, liturgy and other such books in the Irish language as might be necessary for and are useful for their conversion. If this suggested things were going full steam ahead, it was not to be. Support in Parliament was not forthcoming. Now, you can understand, if you like, the reluctance of MPs. The ambitious plan that was being hatched envisaged the establishment of fund for the education and support of Irish speakers, the publication of the Bible and books of common prayer in Irish. They anticipated also that it would be necessary to have the enforcement of the popery laws to ensure there would be no succession of popish priests. In other words, they wanted the thrust of they perceived the penal laws to be pursued and the Catholic Church disrupted in its activity in terms of priest missioning, but also in terms of Catholic education. They placed great hope on the emerging network of charity schools. And in addition, which was certainly precocious in its implication, the introduction of a compulsory requirement that all children between the ages of 7 and 10 and 12 attend a school for 6 months every year. And also regulation in that line was to emerge for more than a century and a half. The problem, however, was that in the absence of backing of Parliament, that this was very difficult to pursue. The reasons for this are less clear-cut, but William Hamilton, who was Archdeacon in Armagh, suggested that the plan was to fall on the rocks of party opposition. Irish politics at that stage was divided between Whigs and Tories, and the implication being that perhaps one of the worst, one of the more lamentable manifestations of party politics is that people just oppose almost by definition. Certainly, there is evidence to indicate that there was resistance on these grounds, evidenced in the activity of the Tory Bishop of Calloo, one Thomas Lindsay, who presented the House of Lords in 1711 with the heads of a bill for the Union Division of Parishes, which included a provision for erecting free schools to teach Irish children the English tongue. In other words, the point of the matter is that those who demurred or differed with the thrust of the Convocation plan, and indeed were at odds with Richardson's analysis, were reluctant to surrender the commitment to Anglicizing, implicit in the suggestion that evangelizing would occur through the Irish language. The effect of this was that the Convocation plan really has got to take a back seat. And effectively, the vacuum that was created thereby was assumed and taken up by John Richardson. It's already stated, Richardson was based in County Cavan, but he was regarded, certainly by those who supported his plans, as in the words of William Hamilton, the aforementioned Archdeacon of Armagh, as a worthy good man, very well fitted to be employed in propagating true religion among the natives of this kingdom. Now, the means by which Richardson sought to make his case was through print. And it's in this context that I would refer you to the Robinson Library, because though it doesn't have all of his titles, it has a number. One of his works was the publication in Irish of a collection of 5 sermons, one of which was of his own composition, which is the first tangible expression in print of his commitment. It was of less consequence, I dare say, perhaps, than his more detailed proposal for the conversion of the Popish natives to the established religion, which is a substantial tract which is published in Dublin also in 1711, which might be described as an extended articulation of the case in favour of a multi-pronged approach to the evangelizing of monoglot Catholics through the medium of Irish. It too perhaps didn't prompt the support and expectation and high hopes that Richardson would have of it, which caused him to appeal to the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge in London, which is sufficiently impressed by his scheme, and by the publication in London, indeed, in 1912 of an extended rationale of his case in support of evangelizing through Irish. And it was encouraged thereby to provide the funds for the publication of a bilingual catechism, an Irish language version of the Book of Common Prayer, and other texts. Unfortunately, however, as the records of that organization demonstrate, the appetite for these texts was small. Some 6,000 copies each of the Book of Common Prayer and the Catechism, and 3,000 copies of Richardson's history of the various attempts to convert Irish Catholics, a mine of information on this subject, were printed, but only a small number were sold or distributed. Now, Richardson's attitude to Irish was what I describe as, broadly speaking, instrumental. He wasn't particularly enthusiastic about the language as such. He saw it as a means to an end. He vowed that he regarded Irish simply as a tool of evangelizing. In a statement in his short history, in which he observed, I quote, "I should not be for encouraging the language any further than it is necessary to promote the conversion of the Irish and the salvation of their souls." He went on later, when he pointed out that his proposal was, in terms of making use of the language, was motivated by his perception that it was, and I quote, "the most effectual way to diminish the use of it hereafter." In other words, Richardson operated very much within a realm of Irish Protestantism, which was generally sustained its suspicion and unease. The idea Richardson had was that the larger goal of converting Catholics, safeguard of their souls, and perhaps more culturally in terms of just advancing Anglicism, in the long term would be advanced if the usage of Irish was employed in order to inculcate or introduce and inculcate methods and ways of thinking about religion, but also perhaps in culture that if supported and favoured and echoed and dovetailed with Anglicization. Now, Richardson's attitude, in short, then, weren't diametrically different to that of the majority of the Protestant elite in the 30 years after the Battle of the Boyne, when anti-Catholic suspicion, anti-Irish attitude, and skepticism or suspicion of the Irish language was at its most acute. And yet, at the same time, there was no further attempt made, so there was occasionally referred to introduce regulations or legislation that would seek to confine and corral and restrict the usage. In that respect, the argument and perception of a commentator in the 1690s that this was not practical prevailed. But the disposition in terms of reforming and advancing society in the aftermath of the failure to take up the plan of convocation, and indeed the failure of Richardson's plans and writings to have an attitudinal impact or a major attitudinal impact and breakthrough, ensure that such plans for cultural change that were being promoted through the realms of education centred predominantly on using the English language. There was one notable exception. The Bishop of Down and Dromore, Francis Hutchinson, printed a bilingual catechism in 1722, set in a supposedly easy-to-read phonetic script to assist with the conversion of the Irish-speaking Catholic population on Rathlin Island. It's perhaps well seen in tandem with Richardson's scheme and plan, but it was, like Richardson's, essentially an isolated initiative that is intriguing and illustrative, but didn't achieve anything like the goal that its proponents in this instance have set themselves. In broad terms, the generality of Irish Protestants favoured the perspective of the Society for Promotion of Christian Knowledge of London, which in this respect adhere to the view that the noble object of civilising the people of Scotland as well as Ireland will be best achieved by extirpating popery and the Irish language, and it provided funds to assist with this project. However, as time passed, and no or little visible progress was registered, so doubts multiplied. There was no going back to the drawing board, however, and the effect of this, though, meant that when new school initiatives were being proposed thereafter, is that they operated within a realm which, while setting evangelizing or conversion as a goal, were pursued through the medium of the English language. This was the case certainly of the system of charter schools as the system that was an educational system that was established with this end in the 1730s and took over from the now faltering charity schools which had preceded them. Lest one thinks this is just accidental, it's noteworthy, for example, that Bishop Henry Mole of Cork, who was important in the advancement of this scheme, had disagreed, albeit tactfully, with Richardson on the wisdom of pursuing evangelization through the medium of Irish. Hugh Bolter, who was another champion, was a very strong proponent of Anglicisation. The point of the matter is that when it came to it, and in contrast, arguably, to the position taken by Richardson, they were not willing to prioritise Anglicisation, evangelization over Anglicisation. The viewpoint remained strongly anchored and strongly adhered to that English was the superior language as the language of civility, and thus they were encouraging this conviction and increasingly contented in this conclusion by the fact that the pattern of language usage in the country was already by the 1730s showing signs of seeing a greater usage of English. The official position, insofar as one can identify it, might be seen to be illustrated by a 1738 Act authorising that all proceedings in courts of justice shall be in the English language. Though it's important that we don't misinterpret the piece of legislation. It was more targeted at the continuing usage of Latin and French rather than Irish, but the emphasis on English, I think, well captures the prevailing position. And yet at the same time, I don't leave you with the impression that attitudes to the Irish language amongst the Protestant interests in Ireland were fixed and indeed were unaccommodatingly hostile or fixedly hostile. The sectional suspicion, which I've been talking about, in which undermined Richardson's initiative and shaped attitude, was at its peak in the quarter century after the Battle of the Boyne. But even then, there are individuals one can identify who took a more positive or more benign perspective. Notably, in their ranks was one Arthur Brownlow of County Armagh, whose interest in Irish, which has been well chronicled and been traced by Cunningham and Gillespie in an important article, probably reflected his own particular lineage. For others, I would suggest perhaps there was a combination of intellectual curiosity and a desire, which can be dovetailed with this, to embrace new currents of inquiry that fueled a greater interest in the subject. And this brings us to the world and to the literary circle of Jonathan Swift, Anthony Raymond, and those they gathered around them. Now, the clearest manifestations of this, and clearest manifestations of the fact that they were fueled by curiosity, fueled very much by historical inquiry and by the desire to acquire greater insights and knowledge of both Irish history and of the culture of the Irish people in their midst, had reached a point by the 1720s that had resulted in some notable publications. Publication by Bishop William Nicholson of Derry in 1724 of the Irish Historical Library, which contains reference to Irish manuscripts, is one such illustration. Though perhaps the landmark publication of this decade, or was a controversial one, was the publication of an English language version of Geoffrey Keating's celebrated Foras Fasa ar Éireann, or the Basis of Knowledge in Ireland, which was seen as the closest thing, though it was very flawed in the eyes of most Protestants, it was seen as the closest thing to a summit of history in Ireland. It was a significant intellectual achievement, and that it wasn't, obviously, a non-partisan reading of the past. But there were a couple of other indications also that were perhaps that there was the beginnings of a trend. The publication by the specialist musical publishers John and William Neal of a number of choice collections that included Irish music. And in the case of one title, a collection of the most celebrated Irish tunes, I would put in this world, or in this realm of, which suggests that there was a diminution in certain quarters in antipathy to language, and this was more, there's greater receptivity to if not its politics, certainly to the culture that's Irish. And this could indeed impact in the realms of religion as well. The publication in 1736 of the first of several editions of James Gallagher's Irish Sermons is a further evidence of this amelioration in atmosphere to which I wish to or have made reference. It was accented, obviously, by the diminution in the perception of the seriousness of the threat presented by Roman Catholicism and, most importantly, Jacobitism, when it was the latter in which there was the clear evidence that the perceived threat was easing. In that context, the failure of Ireland to rise in 1745-46 in tandem with the Jacobite revolt in Scotland was significant. The decision of the papacy in 1766 not to recognise the young pretender as a successor to James III was obviously also important. But there are unexpected signals that can be identified in the society at large, which bear witness to or are consistent with the conclusion that there was the adoption incrementally of a more relaxed attitude towards the Irish language. For example, it was possible in Dublin in the 1750s, from the 1750s, if one was so minded, to go to a Protestant church and hear a sermon in Irish. 1758, for example, Anthony Burke, a curate based at Hollywood in County Wicklow, the newspaper announced, had recently preached the first sermon in Irish in St. Patrick's Cathedral to a very numerous congregation. Further, such reports would indicate that there was still a certain novelty. And what is not clear to me is that the absence of such reports and indeed advertisements on occasion, that whether this had become normal by that stage or indeed it had declined for want of engagement. Other signals which suggest that there is thawing of attitude is taking place can be identified likewise in the press, in the appearance of advertisements or notices for and by Gaelic scholars, letting known their services were available. Maurice O'Gorman, a self-styled professor of Irish, advised readers of Faulkner's Dublin Journal in 1766 that as well as assisting gentlemen eager to access, quote, the many valuable chronicles and compositions still preserved among us, reflected the interest in the collection of Irish language manuscripts, also indicated that he was available to provide education. And indeed, this was an area in which, given its rapid growth, which provided an opportunity. Still in all, it was highly unusual, but I would suggest a pointer to the direction things are going among a smaller element of the Protestant community in Ireland, when it was announced in the newspaper Dublin Mercury in 1772 that a school had been founded, and I quote, to prevent as much as possible the decay of the Irish language, a language, it went on, which is highly esteemed by all who have the knowledge of it. Now, this almost certainly originated with the Catholic press, elected to the Catholic author. But the fact that this sentiment is identified with this point, and that it wasn't singled out for aspersion, is consistent with the conclusion I'm trying to advance, in that, yes, what one can see in the second quarter and moving into the third quarter of the 18th century is that attitudes are altering, and that the amelioration in Protestant attitude is now visible, and it has been recognized by Catholics of a variety of backdrops, for a variety of reasons in their actions. Now, they could certainly take heart in this respect from the fact that by this stage, interest amongst the elements of the Protestant elite in Irish history and antiquity had reached a quite different level than that which we have identified and made reference to in the 1720s. It's not an opportune moment, and time wouldn't allow it in any event, to talk about the development of interest in Irish antiquarianism and antiquity. But one can indicate that the two, or that at least under the umbrella of an interest in Irish antiquity, there emerges a greater receptivity, a greater openness to engagement and an acceptance of the utility of the Irish language. The Antiquities Committee of the Royal Dublin Society, to which Charles O'Connor, perhaps the most thoughtful and probably the most capable Irish language commentator with knowledge of Irish in this period, it was admitted as a member in the early 1770s, is an illustration in this respect. Now, the Antiquities Committee of the Royal Dublin Society had a relatively brief existence, but it acted as an important conduit of knowledge and inquiry. It was of enormous symbolic and practical significance, I suggest, as a bridge between the Irish-speaking community of scribes and scholars, which was eager for patrons, and those members of the Anglophone elite who required assistance if they were to acquire other than the most superficial knowledge of the country's past. It's interesting in this respect that Maurice O'Gorman, who was an important conduit of Irish language manuscripts, both as a transcriber and as a seller of manuscripts, taught Charles Valency Irish, or perhaps should I say, introduced Charles Valency to Irish, upon which he was to build an edifice of interpretation, which really was not tenable, but which paradoxically or ironically actually had a positive effect in this respect. 1772, Valency published his essay on the antiquity of the Celtic language. In this, he famously claimed comparison of that Irish was basically connected to and bound up and originated with the Phoenician language, for which there's absolutely no linguistic evidence, which is actually fundamentally wrong. But nonetheless, it served a useful purpose at the time because it effectively identified Irish with a language of the Mediterranean, with a language of an advanced civilization, which was an important consideration and which encourages, well, one seems by the late 1770s, a greater readiness to utilize what would be described in modern Irish parlance as the proverbial couple focal, the few words you can find in the literary commentary and in some of the illustrative commentary of this period for cliche phrases in Irish as they might be described as naboclesh. Don't bother with it. It anglicized into nabocklesh or fog shin, another term. I leave it alone. One shouldn't read too much into these, but I think in practical terms, though, they are an illustration of the percolation societally and of their appearance in print, of their acceptance, at least partially, in that society. Is that insignificant, I suspect, in this context, when the Royal Irish Academy was founded in 1785, that it's identified the study of Irish antiquity as a central aspect of its endeavour, and in the early 1790s it was to provide prizes for inquiry into Irish language and Irish antiquity. I'm not trying to suggest that atavistic hostilities don't persist. You can find them in the conservative reaction to the agrarian protest that occurs in the 1780s that was important in energising conservative Protestant thinking at the latter part of the century. But the publication by Charlotte Brooke of A Relics of Irish Poetry in 1789, and what I mentioned at the outset, the attempt by Henry Flood, who wouldn't have fitted the definition one would have thought of a natural advocate of inquiry into the past. But his attempt to bequeath the bulk of his estate to Trinity College to fund the endowment professorship of Irish, it was a signal moment. And I think in that context, Utley-Urson's identification of this event as symbolic in this context is to be echoed. The will was overturned, and I can explain more fully. Now, just to bring this to a conclusion, it might in this context then seem inevitable that the emergence of political radicalism in the form of the United Irishmen, an organisation seeking to break the connection with England, should have given a great surge to an interest in inquiry in Irish, and in the Irish language generally, societally, at the end of the 18th century. In practice, this is not really the case. The United Irishmen weren't, like later Irish nationalist movements, disposed to look backwards or to look to the past for as an arsenal of ideas and support for their idea. Nonetheless, one can see in the Cork Gazette, which the editor of which, Dennis Driscoll, seemed to have taken a more positive attitude, and in his comments was prepared to regard and did describe the Irish language as warmly, and it described it, quote, as our native language, a pointer to the future. The publication out of Belfast of a Gaelic magazine called Bulg on Tuller, in which Thomas Russell may have had a part, is another manifestation of this. The point of the matter is as the century comes to a conclusion, one has arrived at a situation in which there is a strong strand of opinion within society at large, which is willing to take a more supportive attitude, a less critical attitude towards the Irish language in particular. One should not exaggerate this, though, because there was also, as the conservative response to the United Irishmen and to agrarian protest illustrates, a reflexive disposition within many ranks of Irish Protestantism to identify the language with sedition, or at least to perceive it suspiciously. There was at the same time no reversion to the calls for eradication, however timorously they may have been made a century earlier, or to the visible official antipathy that one can identify then. Indicatively, when the military authorities produced a revised version of the rules and regulations for the better ordering of His Majesty's Army, that's the title of the publication in November 1806, they printed a version in a broadside format in Irish, as well as English, to illustrate that for those who were literate, they were seeking access. It may well have been motivated by a pragmatic wish to enhance recruitment, but it symbolized how far the state had moved. And I would suggest how far society had moved also in its attitude towards the language. Would be probably to exaggerate to claim that it represented official recognition of Irish society as bilingual, but it certainly illustrated that the Irish language could no longer be ignored by those agencies of the state that had aspired to communicate with the population as a whole. Thank you.